Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing Iraq. Has it always been a Sunni Shia war? Joining us is Sharif Nashashebi, an award-winning journalist and an analyst on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. Throughout history, we've seen that religious people are fighting in the name of God and fighting for the sake of God, whereas each religion actually calls out for peace and shouldn't actually be fighting. Why does each religion take this role in apparently fighting for God when each religion actually calls out for peace?
Well, the holy books of all these religions have texts that are interpreted and misinterpreted in different ways. So if you're an extremist, you will take a text in a way that will justify your actions. So unfortunately, religion has been used and abused by people of all shades to justify their actions, and extremists are no different. For every passage that calls for peace, they will say, "Oh well, this sentence means that we're justified in doing that," and unfortunately, that's been the way throughout history.
Don't you think that, do you think extremists can't coexist with different faiths and different believers?
Well, the problem is that extremism by its nature is intolerant to other shades of opinion. So, while people can say, well, freedom of speech and diversity, and that's fine, extremists are not as tolerant in those views. They will say that people have to adhere to their interpretation, or face punishment or death or other penalties like that. So this is the fundamental problem with extremism. They cannot live peacefully with those who are not also extremists, because they are seen as lesser people and deserving of punishment.
Do you think if these people were to have religious dialogue and conferences that they may change their mind?
Well, there are certainly cases of for instance, former jihadis turning, being reformed and kind of being disillusioned with the organizations they've joined or the things they've done. So that's certainly the case, and I think there's a very important part to play in programs that seek to attract these jihadis and convince them of another way. But there also has to be a proper analysis of why people are attracted to those ideologies in the first place. It has to be a two-pronged approach. And unfortunately, I find that there is too much emphasis these days on military tactics and solutions to these issues, rather than sitting down and saying what is causing, what social issues, what economic issues, what ideological issues are causing people to be attracted to that in the first place. I think there's far too much emphasis on one and not on the other. And unless we look at the causes, we are unlikely to really deal with this issue properly.
In Iraq, before the extremists actually invaded, there was always a problem apparently between the Sunnis and the Shia. What do you think caused that?
Well, the sectarian issue was really exploded by the U.S. invasion. The U.S. had absolutely no knowledge that there were even these different sects in Iraq. George Bush was woefully ignorant of the fabric in Iraq. So this really blew up the sectarian situation in Iraq, and ever since then, there has been identity politics in Iraq. People identify with their sect primarily. The political system is based on sect, where the prime minister has to be a Shia, each role in government has to be dictated by certain sects. So we have now the entrenchment of sectarianism in Iraq, and you see now that the situation in terms of sectarianism is still dire. It has never improved even after U.S. troops left. So I think the U.S. walked in, destroyed Iraq, did not realize that they were playing power politics with people from different sects. And this is, I think, going to be a very long-term problem for Iraq and other countries in the region, in terms of getting people to view themselves primarily as citizens of that country rather than members of a particular community.
Why is it in the Middle East, and especially Iraq, that people just have to identify themselves with religion and with the sect they're from?
This dates back to colonial times. The British and French in the Middle East, they set up hierarchies of power that favored certain communities over others. to make it easier for the colonial powers to maintain control. That sowed the seeds for the future conflict, because certain communities were favored and others were sidelined. Resentment grew, but that resentment was really pushed down by force, either by brutal leaders in the countries or by the colonial powers. So eventually, when these systems would be challenged, because they'd been in place for so many decades, we are seeing now the result and the explosion of these issues, of these colonial practices. Not just in the Middle East, but in Africa as well, where they would often place minority communities to rule over the majority and make it easier in terms of divide and rule to rule over those countries. And this is now, we are seeing the fruits of these really disastrous colonial policies.
Do you think that that has actually affected Muslims all around the world in a way?
Well, in the sense that, I mean, certainly, for instance, Muslim communities in the West, I mean, we all come from various countries in Asia or Africa or the Middle East. So certainly when we see turmoil in these regions, it affects us. We feel personally affected. We have family and friends in those regions. I don't think, in terms of, I don't think the identity crisis is as pronounced I mean, for instance, in London, I don't know if any of my Muslim or Arab friends, I don't know if they're Shia or Sunni or Christian. No one asks, no one cares. I don't think it's as much of an issue. I remember when we grew up as kids during the Iran-Iraq war, I mean, we used to hang out as Arabs and Iranians. We never discussed the war, there was never animosity. I think it's easier as a kind of expatriate community to feel less involved in these issues that divide us. And then when you go back to the region, you suddenly see, the issue of identity is much more stark. I think perhaps because in the West, for instance, we are a minority community as it is, so we're probably less likely to want to divide ourselves even more. And because we have certain rights here to express ourselves and to live together, and without being discriminated against in many ways. So I think certainly the issue of identity, the divisions of identity, are more pronounced back home than they are outside.
But then when we have the Prime Minister like David Cameron giving his speech against Muslims in a way, he doesn't say it like bluntly, but then everybody knows that what he's saying is against Muslims. Like when he spoke about multiculturalism in the UK, he was kind of like attacking the Muslims as not doing enough for the country, even though like the majority of Muslims are doing a lot. And then at the same time, when he spoke about the situation in Iraq, he kind of attacked Islam in the sense that he did speak of the extremism, but he still kind of made people scared in a way from Muslims. Do you think that would kind of like make us more conscious of ourselves and of how we behave in public?
Well, I think there's a very counterproductive discrepancy between the statements of politicians and the results of policy. Politicians generally tend to be very careful, sometimes vague in their wording, because they don't want to be seen as directly targeting a certain community. They will often say that the majority of Muslims are peaceful and law-abiding, and then you have policies that directly discriminate against Muslims. In airports, on the streets, in terms of employment, things like that. So Muslims will experience this kind of discrimination and say, well, what Cameron and other politicians say doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. That it's almost like an evasive tactic to say, well, we do accept and we do appreciate the Muslim community, but then, behind closed doors, there are policies there to target the community. So I think this is very counterproductive. The government, on the one hand, wants the Muslim community to cooperate with them, to be integrated, but that's going to be very difficult as long as Muslims, in their daily lives feel a certain sense of discrimination through policies by the government. I think in terms of creating fear of Muslims in Britain or the US or whatever, I think the media plays perhaps an even bigger role in the demonization and fear-mongering. Because you have, for instance, tabloids, particularly tabloids, that don't feel the need to hold back in the way that politicians might. I mean, politicians have to they have to think of electorates, they have to think of other issues of power, whereas tabloids don't feel the need to appease any certain group or abide by any certain kind of standards. So they'll use much more direct and harsh language about Muslims because they sell newspapers that way or they attract audiences. And they have now a global audience. All these papers, all these publications have online editions, so there's no local media anymore. Everything's international.
So you're saying that the media is actually making more of a divide between the Muslims and giving a bad image about the Muslims.
Yeah, but if you analyze media coverage of Muslims, it invariably tends to be negative connotations of Muslim portrayal, particularly with the tabloids, who their business is based on sensationalism, not even necessarily on accuracy. There are some stories are completely fabricated about Muslims. So these tabloids breed on sensationalism that require a level of fear-mongering, which today is kind of targeted at Muslims, but in the past has been targeted against other communities. That is how they operate in a way that politicians in Britain, for instance, have to be more nuanced. Tabloids can be very brash about their opinions, and this is a real problem. They have, I think, a bigger influence in terms of fear-mongering and demonizing Muslims than I think politicians do in this country. Obviously, parties like UKIP, for example, to me they are the tabloid version of political parties. So I think they have a similarity with the tabloids in terms of their very brash language. But for the mainstream parties, they can be more nuanced, whereas tabloids think, well, we don't have to be held to those standards and we can say what we want.
What do they actually gain from this?
Readership. Unfortunately now in Britain and in Europe and elsewhere, you have a rising debate about immigration, about integration, about multiculturalism, and there are real public fears about the consequences of these policies on top of the economic measures of austerity and things like that. So I think these tabloids play on those fears, they exacerbate those fears, and that increases their readership, that increases their audiences. Media is a business. So if they will provide news to if they think that their audiences will want that news, they will provide that news. And unfortunately, fear of Muslims, fear of immigrants, fear of integration, of multiculturalism, of the economic impact, these are very real issues that are being debated across Europe, in the Americas and elsewhere, in Australia. So the media is playing up on these existing fears.
How did Muslims actually become a target?
Well, they are a fairly recent community in Britain compared to other communities. Older communities like the Caribbean communities, the Jewish community, the Irish. They've been here for longer. They all face the same thing. So eventually, as they become more integrated, it becomes less tenable to portray them as demons, as threats. The Muslims are a more recent community. You had the same, for instance, you have the same issue with East Europeans. Over the last 10 years, there was a huge influx of East Europeans here, and what you started noticing in the media, and particularly the tabloids, is similar scaremongering about East Europeans coming here, taking our jobs, leeching off the state. There were very similar parallels to how the Muslims were being portrayed. And I used to say that East Europeans are the new Muslims because of the way they were being portrayed. I think this is an issue of when there is a new and growing community in a country such as Britain, there is naturally a tendency to be suspicious, to view them as a potential threat. And then I think, and this will happen with the Muslim community, as we get older and more established in this country, I think that will die down. But we are in the stage at the moment where we are still seen in that light. And obviously the situation in the Muslim world is exacerbating that, because people see what goes on there and thinks that the Muslim community here is simply an extension of the conflicts over there, which is not the case.
Going back to the Middle East, the ISIS, Daesh, they claim to be Sunni. Do you think that the other Sunni members actually accept them?
Not at all. I mean, if you look at the full spectrum of Sunni Islam, of leaders, of clerics, of preachers, there has been so much condemnation, not just of Daesh, but of their representation of themselves as Sunni Muslims, as defenders of Sunni Islam. Even other jihadist groups and other and Salafist preachers and others have been saying that they don't represent what they say they represent. And I think this is very important, that it's not an issue of jihadists versus moderates. The full political spectrum, ideological spectrum, have been condemning them. And it's really no surprise, because however they may talk about representing Sunni Islam or defending Sunni Islamic interests, if you look at their barbarity on the ground, Sunni Muslims are also directly targeted by ISIS. Everyone is targeted. So it's really quite ridiculous for Daesh to say that they represent them. In the same way that, for instance, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, when it was flourishing in Iraq, it was claiming to be some kind of bulwark against Shia expansionism. But they treated the Iraqi Sunnis so badly, in the end they rose up against Al-Qaeda. So their claimed ideology, you can see right through it. So I think it's very important that really the full spectrum of Sunni Islam has been coming out and saying, you don't represent us, what you're doing is un-Islamic, it's completely contrary to Islamic teachings, and you are targeting Sunni Muslims as well.
Sadly, that point isn't actually focused on in the media. Till today, when the Sunni lecturers and speakers and scholars would say this, the media doesn't really focus on it. They would focus more on ISIS actually being a Sunni sect. Do you think that creates hatred between the Shias and Sunnis who have nothing to do with ISIS, but it would kind of create conflict between them, like in their communities, like in Iraq and in the UK?
Well, I think, I'm speaking of the media here, I think it causes a great deal of tension, I mean, not just within the Muslim community, but between the Muslim community and others in this country, because I've always found it amazing that, you'll constantly see people in the media saying, why aren't Muslims condemning ISIS? They condemn them every day. I mean, there are so many examples of condemnation that you think, okay, you are either so ignorant that you shouldn't be on the media saying, why aren't Muslims condemning this? Or you know they're condemning it and it doesn't suit your agenda to say that. So you want to target the Muslim community by saying, why aren't they condemning it? And there is such a disconnect between that and the reality on the ground. And then that feeds into public perceptions that because Muslims aren't condemning it, they are somehow supporting it, complicit in it, and then the whole community becomes a threat. This is really very, very dangerous. So as I said, I think it's a combination of ignorance and of convenience that people will say Muslims are not condemning it, even though they know they are, because it doesn't suit their agenda. But there is no doubt that Muslims constantly, Muslims in this country and in other countries in the West go out of their way to condemn ISIS, simply because they think it's wrong, but also they don't want the majority population to view themselves as an extension of this barbaric group.
But till today, as you said, many people are condemning, and we all, the Shias, the Sunnis, the Yazidis, say that they're not Muslim because they're not representing Islam. However, you have a lot of journalists saying that you can't say they're not Muslim because they are claiming they are. What would you say about this?
Well, there's a difference between saying they're not Muslim and saying that what they do is representative of Islam and in the name of Islam. There are two different things. Fine, they are Muslim, or they are Sunni Muslim, but for them to say that what we're doing is sanctioned by Sunni Islam, or what we're doing is in the name of Islam, that's a different issue, and that's the thing that is not true. So I think that there's a confusion there. People have to realize that for them to claim that they're acting on behalf of Sunni Islam is wrong, but the fact that they are Sunni Muslim, that's a different thing.
But then this is what politicians, not just politicians, but journalists and stuff, in a way that they can always attack Islam the way they want, and then just use ISIS, for example, as a way to, as a reason, and just it's also kind of justifying why they would be attacking Islam.
Well, there's two issues here. That, the media, there's an issue of agendas, and some areas of the media have an agenda to portray Muslims as this homogeneous, monolithic threat. And then there is also an issue of ignorance, of laziness. It's easier for the media to portray these issues, these complex issues, in very simplistic ways. either because it makes their job easier, or because certain journalists don't actually know the difference. Never count on a journalist's experience to be telling the story as it is. So there's an issue of agendas, of making one's job easier by simplifying it, and of simply not really knowing the complexity of what you're reporting.
That's true, but sometimes you have like some big newspapers would use an Arab person or a Muslim name, for example, to write the article. So when someone is to read it, for example, yourself or myself, we will think that, oh, this person knows what they're saying. But then when you actually go to the country, for example, you wouldn't see it that way, no?
I mean, well, that's to an extent that's a matter of opinion. You know, you might read something that a Muslim or an Arab has written in a paper and disagree with it, and by that disagreement say that he doesn't represent the general view of this topic. That's really down to an opinion. But certainly there is a habit in the media. For example, if there is an issue where there is a general consensus among Muslims about a certain issue, what certain media outlets might do is get someone who holds a very fringe opinion of that, who has a dissenting view but is such a fringe element, portray that as a much more general opinion, and again cause controversy by that opinion, and that brings in more readership and more audiences and circulation. So again, we have to look at the media as a business, and often the media, particularly in the commentary pages, it thrives on controversy. So they will attract readers in that way, and often, so unfortunately, you get some pretty extremist people in Britain and elsewhere who are touted as spokespeople for the Muslim community when they're anything but. But again, that is either down to simple ignorance of how representative these people are, or simply as a desire to create controversy and draw in audiences from that.
There are many conspiracy theories of and about ISIS, and the latest one was ISIS is actually Israeli, and it has nothing to do with Islam and with Al-Qaeda and stuff. What's your view on this?
Well, there are so many competing theories about the origins of ISIS and where ISIS receives its support, and this is it's been very difficult to establish exactly how it was created and where it gets its support. And because of this difficulty, certain countries, governments, groups have thrived on propagating conspiracies about either that Israel was behind it, or the US, or Iran, or Saudi, and it's very difficult to get to the bottom of it. And I think but I think we have kind of moved on from that, in the sense that ISIS, its gains in Iraq and Syria have made it much more self-functioning in terms of its own revenues. Then I think it's less dependent now on money from the outside. When it's now able to export oil, it's able to trade, it's looted banks. So it's now a much more a self-sustaining economy than it used to be. So I think the argument, I think it's important to try and trace the true and accurate origins of ISIS, but also we have to recognize now that it's moved on from that, and we have to also analyze where its current revenues and support are coming from.
With its support, like you said that the US isn't actually supporting it because they're independent and they don't really need any help in any way. But then recently the US accidentally gave them aid and gave them weapons.
Well, basically what I'm saying is there is no proof as yet that any particular government has officially helped or is officially helping ISIS. And in the absence of any of this kind of proof, with the propagation of all these conspiracies and theories, I don't want to come out and say, yes, this particular country is helping ISIS, because there's simply so much claim and counterclaim. And I think this is the problem. But it's not helped because of the complicated situation on the ground. For example, the fact that ISIS has threatened Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, but not Israel, that gives people cause to say, well, Israel's behind it. The fact that the Assad regime, until very recently, hadn't been fighting ISIS, people were saying, well, that means that the Assad regime is behind ISIS. So there are so many different aspects happening on the ground that are leading people to say, yes, my view is vindicated because this is what's happening. But there's very little proof, certainly, of any governmental official support for ISIS. That's simply the point that I'm making.
As you know, they claim they're Sunni. Many people are saying it has nothing actually got to do with religion, because firstly, they're not actually going with what the Quran states and what, you know, the hadith are from the Prophet and from the Sunni sect as they believe the Khalifas, and they're not actually going by that at all. At the same time, they're killing their own Sunni people. But so people are saying it's more of a political standpoint, in the sense that they don't want the Shia countries to develop, in the sense that because they went into Syria, which many people believe is a Shia sect because they're Alawis, and then at the same time in Iraq because it's governed by a Shia, mainly Shia presidents and stuff, that they're attacking them because they're Shia. Do you think that that's actually the case? At the same time, do you think that's creating more support from the Sunni people because they're removing the Shia?
I don't think it's as simple as that. As I said, ISIS has been targeting all these communities. I mean, it has directly threatened Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Sunnis in Lebanon. I mean, this is a much more general issue. The other rebel groups in Syria, who are predominantly Sunni, have been at war with ISIS from the beginning of this year at a cost of thousands of lives. So I think, again, it's a simplification to say this is some Sunni versus Islam issue. You have a common cause here. You have Shia forces, Sunni forces fighting this group because they all recognize that whatever they might say about representing a certain sect, they're killing everyone. And they are tarnishing the perception of Islam as they are reinforcing this idea that Islam is a religion of violence. And so it is in their interest, not just their physical interest, to stop this kind of marauding group from expanding, but also in terms of harming the religion that they all adhere to.
If ISIS just wanted to kill and create an Islamic state, why would they join the allies of Saddam, the ex-Saddam regime, which is the Ba'ath Party?
I think this was an alliance of convenience. There is no ideological common ground between ISIS and between other Iraqi forces that have risen up. This was an alliance of convenience and resentment towards the policies, since the American invasion, and exacerbated by the rule of Maliki in terms of disenfranchisement of the Sunni community in Iraq. So these groups with no ideological common ground had a common enemy. In this case, it was Maliki, but generally the system in Iraq that disenfranchised Sunni Muslims. But I think you would see cracks. You're already seeing cracks in this alliance where Sunni tribes are saying, well, we can't tolerate the way that you're treating us, in the territory that they gain. So any alliance of convenience is doomed, eventually. But I think they just at that point saw a common cause, and it was complicated by the fact that these tribes, who were central to defeating Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they never got the promises and the dividends that they expected after defeating Al-Qaeda at great cost to them. They didn't get the jobs that they were promised, the integration they were promised, the economic opportunities, salaries, things like that. And that has made it much harder to convince these same communities and tribes to turn against ISIS, because they don't feel that if these promises weren't honored back then, why would they be honored now? So I think the sectarian issue in Iraq has played into ISIS's hands. And this is why ISIS tries to portray itself as a bulwark against Shia Islam to get support from the region, by playing up this issue that this is a big war between these two sects, and support us so we can stop this kind of expansionism. But this is a very cynical game, and anyone who sees what they're doing on the ground can see that they're targeting anyone and everyone, regardless of whether they're Sunni, Shia, or non-Muslim as well.
But when it comes to protecting your country, even though I do believe that they should have, received the promises that they were actually promised, and they should have got the jobs and everything, but when it comes to protecting your country and protecting your people, shouldn't that be the first thing that these people would be actually thinking of, other than, gaining more money, for example, when being employed and so forth?
Look, in any civil conflict in a country, any and all sides think that they are acting in the interest of the country. So this is a fundamental factor in terms of any civil conflict. But also, when you have a country that has gone through what Iraq has gone through, if people can't put food on the table or clothes on their children's backs, educate them, have a roof over their heads, these very simple, basic daily needs of life, when that is lacking, then issues of kind of national issues are less important. When people are going hungry and they're poor and have no prospects. So this has now taken over issues of national issues. But also you have to look as well that the protests against Maliki and against his policies towards the Sunni Muslims in Iraq, before ISIS's rapid expansion in Iraq, these protests had been going on for a year and a half, and they were met with a crackdown, with deaths, with arrests. This consistently aggravated the situation. I mean, the protests started out peacefully, and then they escalated, and there was the reaction was a combination of ignoring those demands and of cracking down heavily on the protesters, to the point that even Shia figures, such as Muqtada Sadr, were saying, these protesters have legitimate demands. And Maliki was ignoring not just the Sunni Muslims, but any of his opponents who were saying, you need to listen to these people, because eventually this is not a tenable situation, it's going to blow up. And I think his reaction to these protests really led the way to ISIS being able to expand as quickly as it did.
But like with Maliki stepping down and with the new Prime Minister at the moment, they've actually met the needs of the Sunni community, in the sense that for everything to go forward, he had to sign and agree with the Kurds and with the Sunnis in Iraq. So in that sense, that's kind of been covered.
Not really. I mean, the issue was not just about Maliki. It was about the system in Iraq, the political system. So I don't think the departure of Maliki in and of itself was going to solve the problem. I think the stage we're at now is a wait and see approach, where we have a new head of Iraq who's from the same political party as Maliki, and this again is breeding suspicion among people that are things going to really change? There might be a different face, but will the policies change? There's a wait and see approach now. I don't think that Abadi's been in power for long enough to see any tangible change on the ground, even with the good intentions. We just haven't had enough time yet. So I think people are waiting to see whether a change in leadership is going to cause a change in the situation on the ground and a change in government policy. We're not there yet.
You mentioned the actual system in Iraq, the political system. Can you just explain that further?
Well, the general disempowerment, disenfranchisement of the Sunni community in Iraq since the invasion of the US invasion. It's this general sense that they are disenfranchised and that they're not getting the same opportunities that the Shia majority have. This is what's causing. I mean, whether you think that those grievances are legitimate or not, it is a widely held view in the community there that since they lost power, they are being kind of kept down by the majority population. And unless they get a sense that they have as much a part to play in Iraq as a whole as any other community there, unless that is fixed, there's going to be it's a minority, but it's a large minority. You're going to continue to have these problems where people will associate themselves firstly by tribe or sect or community, rather than as Iraqis as one unitary state for all its citizens.
But there are many Sunni parliament members actually in Iraq.
Well, a lot of these MPs, they either come out in opposition to government policies. I mean, it's a very fractious. The government itself is fractious, let alone parliament. So they often come out against them. Some of these Sunni MPs, for example, or ministers, are viewed with suspicion by the wider community because they're seen as collaborating with an unjust system. So it's a very complicated situation, whereas you have these two trends where you need a more inclusive government and a more inclusive system to make it work. But until the system itself is fixed, then having that inclusivity is a risk, because then whoever joins the new government, for example, their community might say, well, maybe he's a collaborator, he's suspect now. So it's a kind of chicken and egg situation. You need to be inclusive, but you need a well-functioning system for that inclusivity to really bear fruit.
The thing is, with the government and with the elections, Maliki's party was actually elected. They were wanted. So for then everyone to go against it, isn't that like going against democracy? Even though, of course, democracy isn't 100% taking place in Iraq, but to a certain extent, because the majority of people voted for him, shouldn't they actually be able to be in power?
Well, I mean, look, democracy is not simply elections. It has to be respect for human rights in the country, of diversity, of tolerance, and this is what's lacking. You have now a phenomenon in the Middle East, for example, of leaders being elected but acting dictatorially. And I think this is the situation we had in Iraq, is you had a leader who was elected, but then consolidated more and more power to the point that, I mean, he had a lot of opponents within the Shia camp as well. This was not a Sunni Shia split in Iraq. This was opposition to someone who was being seen as as becoming a strongman, of coalescing all power around him. You had a similar situation in Egypt, for instance, when Morsi was elected. He was democratically elected, and then there was increasing public anger at how he was ignoring the opposition, of how he was consolidating the power of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is a trend that needs to be looked at very carefully in these countries, is that being elected in and of itself doesn't give you a mandate to do whatever you want. If you are not inclusive, if your policies are causing so much public anger that they are destabilizing the entire country, then your rule becomes untenable. And you had, by the end, Iran, Sistani, all these major players in Iraq saying Maliki had to go. So I think there is a misconception in these countries that elections is the be-all and end-all of democracy. That's not the case. If you're elected, you have to be accountable and representative of all communities. And when you stop doing that, when you are more of a divisive figure than a unifying figure, your legitimacy as a leader, whether elected or not, is heavily tarnished.
Don't you think the problem isn't going to actually resolve, because we have it as, like in Iraq, the government, and also in Lebanon, like it always goes down to what religion and what sect you're from. It doesn't really matter, what your party is, what your party stands for. It's more of, okay, you're a Shia, you're a Sunni, you're a Christian, you're Kurd, this is how we're going to be splitting it.
This is a fundamental problem. As you said, in Iraq and in Lebanon, you have systems of governments, systems of politics that are fundamentally sectarian, where certain roles are assigned to certain sects. And this reinforces people seeing themselves primarily by their sect rather than by nationality or citizenship. And this is a problem. But again, it's a chicken and egg situation, because of this entrenched system, this sectarian system. If you were to abolish that system, the reason why certain communities are against abolishing the system is because if they are a minority, then they will lose more power. If you have a genuine democracy in these countries and people still identify by sect, then the majority sect is going to get more power than it currently has. Then the other view, for example, the problem is that the Taif agreement, which resolved the civil war in Lebanon, was based on the demographics of Lebanon at the time. So political power was split between communities according to the demographics at the time, which today are not representative of Lebanon at the moment. So, for instance, in terms of political power, the Shia community as a demographic group is much larger than the others, but they don't have the representative amount of political power. So eventually, in systems that are entrenched in this way, as demographics change, as dynamics change, these systems will not be representative of the situation on the ground. So they are eventually going to be challenged. But unfortunately now you have the problem with this system, but then opposition to challenging that system because minorities will then lose power. The key is, and it's not an easy thing to resolve, and it certainly won't be resolved quickly, is people have to stop seeing themselves by sect primarily. They have to see themselves as citizens of a country where everyone is treated equal. That is when a sectarian system will be able to be challenged and then replaced by a more egalitarian system. But that's a really big thing to overcome. In countries where for such a long time people view themselves in a certain way, to change that entire mindset is going to take a very long time. But eventually it has to be done, because any country with a diverse population, each of which sticks to themselves and sees themselves by sect and other sects as potential opponents, that damages the entire fabric of the country.
Do you think that would ever happen though? Like people would stop identifying themselves with their sect?
I would like to think so. The region has not always seen itself in this way. The issue of sectarianism, before the US invasion, I never heard words like Sunni or Shia. These were not issues. There was a lot more intermarriage of communal cooperation in those countries. It wasn't always this way. So to me that says it won't always be that way. This is the situation we find ourselves now because of certain outside interventions of internal dynamics that have caused sectarianism to be really highlighted over these last few years. But because that wasn't always the way, I don't think it can always be the way. It's not tenable. If people want to live together, if they want prosperity for their own communities, they can't continue to see themselves within a society that views each other as opponents. They're going to have to get over this. Unfortunately now, at the moment, there is no sign that this is going to happen anytime soon. But I can't accept that sectarianism, certainly the level of dangerous sectarianism that we're in now, is going to be some eternal factor that Middle Easterners and Muslims will have to get used to. I can't believe that will be something that we'll see forever.
But then, like you said, that years back, many people would intermarry. But even today, like when you go there and stuff, you would see that the Sunnis would help the Shia would help the Sunni. Just like when ISIS invaded, many Sunnis and Christians went to mainly Shia-dominated cities, and they were actually welcomed by the Shia. So that kind of does show that it's not as sectarian as we see it as, or are told it is.
Certainly, I mean, look, there are countless examples of these different communities working together, and I think these are ignored by and large. Again, because that doesn't sell. The bad news sells. So people don't want. The media often don't want to portray things as positively because bad news sells. But there is also another trend where, for a long time, people didn't want to believe that sectarianism in the region was as bad as it is. And I think we can't deny the fact that there are groups, communities, governments even in these countries that are willing to target, to kill people based on their sect. And as long as that's the case, we can't deny that sectarianism is a major problem. It suits certain people to overplay the level of sectarianism that there is. But then there is also a sense that some people want to underplay it, maybe out of a sense of denial, that they don't want to believe that this is the case. But you have different forces, targeting other communities simply because they're from that community. And that can't be denied. So we have to look at it both ways. We have to highlight issues of cooperation to say that this is not an inherent conflict between different sects. But we also have to recognize that too many people are falling into this dynamic of saying, well, if that person is Shia or Christian or Sunni, he's my enemy. So these are two realities that need to be addressed.
Hopefully people wouldn't actually have that mindset and would try and be more open and tolerant of other faiths and sects. Thank you very much for joining us on the show, and watch us again on Beneath the Surface.